Okay, we'll make a start and other people can join as we go along. Well, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And this is the third in a series of webinars, the goal of which is to support the development of the next stage of our Child of the North initiative, which is a joint initiative between the N8 Research Partnership and the Northern Health Science Alliance. My name is Stephen Parkinson and I'm a Research Partnership Manager for the N8. If you joined us for one of the previous webinars in the series, welcome back. If you're joining us for the first time today, welcome. The purpose of these webinars is essentially twofold. Firstly, to hear from each of the universities in the N8 Research Partnership about the range of current research activity, working with and in support of children, young peoples and families in their local areas across the North and beyond. And we hope that this will raise awareness of what's going on across our members, but also may lead to new connections and collaborations being made, hopefully. Secondly, we also want to start a discussion about how this ongoing activity can inform and support the development of future collaborative activity and a forward-looking strategy for Child of the North, both as we emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic, but yet at the same time find there are further crises affecting our young people. I'm delighted that today we are joined by several colleagues, in fact, from the University of Manchester to tell us about some of the range of activity and research that is underway there. But we also want the rest of you to contribute as well. So there'll be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of each of the presentations. And if we have time at the end, we can also have an open discussion to explore how what you've heard today you feel could feed into what the future priorities for the Child of the North should be. So what I'll do now is I'll just share my screen to show what the agenda for the session is. Okay, so I will give a brief introduction to Child of the North, and then, as I say, we've got several presentations from colleagues from Manchester, starting with Pam Qualter and Caroline Bond, who are the institutional champions for Child of the North, with an overview of activity at the University of Manchester. Then we have Neil Humphrey, who will be talking about the Be Well programme. Stephanie Gillibrand and Sam Khavandi will talk about their work on inequality in the North during the COVID-19 pandemic. Ola Demkowicz will talk about adolescent mental health and whether there is a North-South divide. And finally, we have Emery with his presentation entitled Local Matters, Educating with a Sense of Place. And after all that, if we have some time left, well, as I say, we'll have a discussion about future priorities for Child of the North. Now, bear with me one second. Just sharing my screen. So just before we start, a little bit of housekeeping. Just so the session is being recorded and we'll make it available for those unable to join us today. To watch back. We'll also share copies of all the presentations if the presenters are happy to do so. Just also to note that we're not using the webinar format on Zoom, we're using the normal meeting format. So if you want to submit any questions as the presentations go along, just use the chat function to do that and we'll pick that up during the Q&A at the end or otherwise ask the question during the Q&A itself. So as I say, before we move on to the Manchester presentations, and for the benefit of you who haven't been here at previous sessions, I just want to say a few words about how we got to where we are with Child of the North. Second. Okay, so as I said, Child of the North is a collaboration between the N8 Research Partnership and the NHSA. Our two organisations share as members the 8 most research-intensive universities in the north of England. So that's Durham, Lancaster, Leeds, Liverpool, Manchester, Newcastle, Sheffield and York. The organisations also share common goals in advocating on behalf of our members and the North's research and innovation strengths and connecting industry and academic expertise across the North. Moreover, Child of the North unites the N8 and NHSA's common interest in tackling health inequalities and better understanding and drawing attention to the social determinants of health. As for Child of the North, our vision for this is to develop a platform for collaboration, high quality research and policy engagement that improve the lives of children living in the North in a post-pandemic age. And Child of the North was conceived shortly before the pandemic as a means of combining and elevating the enormous amount of excellent and impactful research that takes place across the North in relation to children and young people and the experience of growing up in the North. So in terms of the timeline, as I say, it was conceived before COVID, but only shortly before, and was selected as part of a priority setting process by the N8 Research Partnership in late 2019. And it was done so in recognition of the potential critical mass of expertise across our universities and for the potential for genuine impact on a regional and national scale. Inevitably, as the pandemic hit and progressed, we had to recalibrate our vision to an extent. We decided we now wanted to focus on what we as a collective of universities could do to help improve the lives of children in the post-pandemic age. We appointed a number of institutional champions, 1 to 2 per university, and they provide a key point of contact at each institution. As I say, as the pandemic progressed, we realized that the scale and urgency of the impact of COVID on children's lives meant that we needed to do something quicker than sort of a slow burn development. So we decided to pivot away from development of a large programmatic activity in the short term towards doing something that could respond rapidly to the crisis that was unfolding. And this led to the idea of the Child of the North report, which was ultimately published in December last year. So just a brief overview of the report itself. It was the first output from the Child of the North initiative. And the idea behind the report was to capture the impact of the pandemic on children growing up in the region and their experiences of it. In doing so, also unavoidably looks back on the impact of a decade of austerity on the lives of children in the North, the inequalities this had highlighted and how the pandemic was further exacerbating these inequalities. And the report represents the work of more than 40 authors, including academics from all 8 of the N8 universities, but also the Northern Arcs and NHS Trusts, the Bradford Institute of Health Research and several other universities. And our lead authors were Kate Pickett from York and David Taylor Robinson from Liverpool. And through the report, we wanted to emphasise how vital it is to keep the voices of children and young people themselves at the heart of the COVID-19 pandemic recovery strategies and the levelling up agenda. With this in mind, the report uses case studies and stories to foreground individuals' experiences and best practice policies and interventions. And although time and space constraints prevented us from devoting chapters to all groups of children and young people who might have special or additional needs, our policy recommendations are broad and deep enough that if enacted in a timely fashion and at scale, could profoundly improve the health, well-being and life chances of all children. So on to the report findings. These quotes just capture some of the report's key messages. The overarching message, I guess, is that the pandemic has only exacerbated pre-existing vulnerabilities and inequalities that too many children in the North face. This means Northern children are more at risk of a range of adverse health and wellbeing outcomes than their non-Northern counterparts. And the report came up with 18 recommendations in all, covering all the areas mentioned on the previous slide. Throughout the writing of the report, we were conscious of the need to avoid painting a picture of what some might call Northern exceptionalism. That, we accept that the vulnerabilities and inequalities found in the North also affect children in other parts of the country. However, our argument was that it was through looking at the North as a whole that a clear picture of these inequalities emerged. So turning now to where we're going next and sort of this stage of development, if you like. Following the report's launch, we had a parliamentary launch for the report in March 2022, which was hosted by Liz Twist, who's the MP for Blaydon in the North East. And we had a number of Northern MPs attend that, including Bridget Phillipson, who's the Shadow Secretary of State for Education, Emma Lawbuck, Kim Ledbetter and Andy MacDonald, just to mention a few. And one direct result of that parliamentary launch event was the proposal to set up a Child of the North all-party parliamentary group. This APPG will hold inquiries looking in more detail at issues raised in the Child of the North report, and starting with the cost of living crisis. And I'll say a bit more about this in a second. At the same time, we are now looking to develop a future strategy and to scope out a large collaborative bid that hopefully will tie together areas of research and policy engagement, including the work of the APPG, to provide a focal point and launch pad for Child of the North's future activities. So I mentioned the launch of the APPG. The first meeting actually took place a couple of weeks ago on the 19th of October in Parliament, and the co-chairs of the APPG are Emma Lawbuck, who is the MP for South Shields, and Mary Robinson, who is MP for Cheadle. That first meeting also saw the first evidence session for the first inquiry, which I mentioned is on the impact of the cost of living crisis on children in the North. And we had evidence provided by representatives from the University of York, Liverpool, the North East Child Poverty Commission and the End Child Poverty Coalition. And the report on that first inquiry is due to be published early in 2023. So turning finally to what I describe as future strategy and collaborative bid development. So this is coming back to the idea behind these webinars. So if we want to develop a strategy for future collective activity, we first need to have a greater shared understanding of what we're currently doing and where the potential points of connection and collective strengths are. And through these webinars, we hope to build up this picture, which will in turn inform development of a strategy and the elements of collaborative bidding activity. And we're planning to hold a workshop early next year in February to focus on both of these aspects. And the key question that we want to think about, and I'd like you to think about today if possible, is what is it that we can do collectively as a group, as the North, if you like, that we can't do alone, e.g. on a regional basis or by sharing experience or good practice. And just to re-emphasize, as I said, it's not about research alone, but obviously policy engagement is also critical to bring about change. One of our key goals through the current activity is to identify where we need to build and sustain capacity to realise the potential benefits of working collectively. And we think that through seeking a significant external funding bid will help us to do this. So I'm going to stop at this point and I will hand over to the first of our presenters today. So I'm very pleased to introduce Pam Qualter and Caroline Bond, who are the institutional champions for Child of the North for Manchester. Pam is a Professor of Education in the Manchester Institute of Education. She's also one of the UK's leading experts on child and adolescent loneliness. Her research also focuses on social and emotional skills within education. And Caroline is also Professor of Education in the Manchester Institute of Education, and her research focuses on educational psychology and developmental psychology, including work to support autistic children and children's rights. So over to you, Pam and Caroline.
Okay, thanks, Stephen.
Thanks, Stephen.
We're going to do a bit of a double act. We're not sure where we're going to speak exactly, but we've got lots of ideas on screen for you. I suppose a nice place to start is to highlight that Caroline and I were brought on board as the institutional champions in 2020. And we thought we'd give you an overview here of what we've been doing with members of the university to try and get a real handle on what's being done across the university that fits with this notion of Child of the North. So do you want to do this slide?
Yep. Yeah, thanks, Pam. So our starting point was in 2021 when we convened a series of workshops at Manchester, and we were really looking at kind of the range of different researchers who might be whose work might actually link into the Child of the North. And we had a great response from across the university. We've got people who are involved from health economics, child development, law, education, so a whole range of different areas, which has been really, really useful, and I think started the, informed the Child of the North report and the work that was done around that. Also, we've got people with expertise in primary and secondary data analysis, quantitative and qualitative methods, and some quite innovative methodologies that people are using. So we really like to kind of find some opportunities to harness some of those things much more through the Child of the North. And as part of that group, we identified a number of regional kind of issues that we felt would feed into the Child of the North work. So obviously regional inequalities was a key theme in the groups. Child and adolescent development and the kind of the needs of that particular population, rather than perhaps over focusing on early years, and also the impact of COVID going forwards post-pandemic. So those were the kind of the key areas that we identified within our groups, and the kind of cross-boundary work that people have started to do has really kind of helped to kind of build that knowledge and enable us to actually kind of set up some really useful links and be able to start thinking about how we might explore different aspects of different priorities within the Child in the North work, using different methodologies and sort of bringing different insights and perspectives to the work that we're doing. So that's been one of the kind of key things that we'd like to develop more of really through this collaboration.
Okay, so really what we found in the workshops was that there was a really rich and varied research landscape where people were addressing all different types of inequalities for the child in the North. And they talked about that love of doing interdisciplinary research and the need to promote that more. I think what brought everybody together was that need to do more interdisciplinary work and collaborate. But what they did note in each of our workshops were some key things that needed to happen. And these need to happen at an institutional level. So we are trying to drive them forward, but it's really hard to do that. And I think it's about being open about that with everyone here. But also they highlighted things that need to happen across the N8 universities. So the first one was linked to leadership and originality. So here they talked a lot about the network demonstrating leadership, not just in terms of research activity, but really in terms of research innovation. So being at the forefront of knowledge creation. And I think that members that came together to play a part in the Child of the North report really felt that they were able to do that. They were able to take that leadership perspective, but they did talk about, whilst that originality was there, that novelty, they were providing key information that drove a particular agenda. They felt there needed to be more directorship across the N8 institutions. And of course, that needed monetary backing. I think it's hard enough within the institution without funding to be able to lead on something like this. But I think it becomes even harder when you're thinking about collaborations across the N8 universities.
And I suppose a linked one to that really, Pam, was around the sustainability of the work as well. So that
yes.
Obviously having a kind of a stable infrastructure of kind of finance and a kind of a coordinated group such as this, it's helpful to have that in place so that people know what they're committing to, and that we can make sure that there is that sustainability, there's that ongoing program of work that we can then develop as part of a group.
Yeah, I mean, I think what people needed from us in those workshops was an idea of the long-term benefits of being part of this Child of the North initiative. You know, what is it that was going to help them out? And I think sometimes people felt that they did want to commit, but actually we didn't know how that was going to happen moving forward. So again, a little bit about funding to try and ensure that people are able to move forward and know that a commitment to the network internally at Manchester, but also wider than that, actually benefits them and the work that they're doing in some way. I think they could obviously see that it benefited them to some extent in terms of impact. And Caroline and I talked about the fact that, you know, particularly through the Child of the North report, they could see that their research was being talked about, was having an impact in terms of policy. So I think that was a way of trying to get people on board. But again, it goes back to sustainability. We need to keep that going, ensure that people can provide that commitment, because there's an outcome for them individually as well.
And I suppose there's the sort of the time that people need to actually kind of be able to sort of meet together to build those links and those networks, and then being able to kind of bring new insights to bear. So I think obviously people need time as well as the infrastructure, so that they can actually kind of capitalize on those opportunities for collaboration together.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, given internal structures and internal research groups. You know, what we're asking people to do here is to think out of the box, and as well as be members of those internal research groups, think about a larger one as well, and who they want from their research groups to actually represent them on that. The other key thing was innovation, and people talked about the fact that it wasn't just about their work having impact. They also wanted to think about what this group could do in terms of bringing new methodologies. And of course, that's the beauty of interdisciplinary research, is that we learn about new methods that we're not aware of within our own discipline. So coming together allows us to be innovative, to really begin to understand more about the experiences of children within the North. And then collaborations, you know, the fact that the network can establish good, fruitful collaborations and connections. where there previously weren't any. And I think we've started doing that. I think we need to do a lot more of that, and it's being able to create those structures, develop those structures internally to enable that to happen. And one last thing, which we haven't included on the slides, was this idea that once we've got, and I'll go back to the funding idea, they talked about ensuring funding for the internal network, but then also from that, what it means is we can establish clear governance structures and knowledge exchange. So we can create those structures that help people engage in a much more fruitful way. So I suppose for us, where do we go next then? Funding the network is the clear thing that came out from all of our workshops with people across the university. But they also talked about a number of other things, didn't they, Caroline?
Yes.
So
I suppose things like kind of attending and presenting at conferences, and it's great that some people from the group already have been involved in those parliamentary groups and have been promoting the report of the Child of the North. But obviously there's lots more that we can do at other conferences as well to kind of promote this work. Also things like working together across our universities, so there might be opportunities for perhaps working on steering groups and steering committees for each other, which again will help to kind of create those links and those development opportunities, sort of research advisory boards, things like that, where we can actually kind of support each other's work and get more familiar with the research that's happening in other places.
Yeah, another idea that's been put forward is the idea of research visits across the N8 universities, you know, going away and working with others just for a week or even just a few days. So somebody perhaps out of your key discipline and having time to sit and chat and learn about the work and the methodologies that get used. They talked about the need to keep in touch. And of course, this nice forum is enabling us to do that.
And we've also done some work together. We have started to develop some research projects, and Pam and I were fortunate enough to work with Uta at Lancaster to put together a project which was a really interesting kind of opportunity to actually kind of start to develop some ideas. Unfortunately, it didn't quite resonate with the wider group at that particular point in time, but I think it did reflect one of the priorities here at Manchester around COVID and the impact of COVID. So trying to kind of develop research projects together would be another kind of useful opportunity and way forward.
Yeah, something that actually wouldn't take so much time that people thought was really important was to develop an online presence. We currently don't have that, but people want to feel like they've got a community and that they belong to something, and that they can kind of point other people towards, so their PhD students, their postdocs and so on. As well as the research visits for staff, people talked about research visits for PhD students, so nice research exchange visits. Again, that might only last a few days or a few weeks, but where people can develop new methodologies or gain knowledge of those. And then the final one was about having colleagues at those N8 universities come on board, PhD supervisory teams. So again, we're getting information and feed in from perhaps different disciplines, but certainly from different researchers on key ideas. So the key thing, I think, from the workshops was that it was about funding, but they also acknowledged that there were all these other things that people could start doing now without a lot of funding, such as the website, PhD supervisory teams, service appointments, and so on. And I think that's all we've got, isn't it, Caroline? So some ideas to move us forward a little bit, Stephen.
Thanks, both. That's really, really useful overview and a slightly different take on sort of thinking about the sort of structural, the strategic approach to it. I think that's been really useful and lots of really good ideas there. And I'm really interested in the difference you say, the sort of the things that can be done without much funding compared to what we can do, but also that sort of the sort of tension between what needs to be unlocked at a local level versus what needs to be unlocked at the N8 wide level. I think it's really useful. I'm very interested if anybody else has any thoughts on any of those issues that would like to add at this stage before we move on. I mean, one thing I was going to say is what we can do at the N8 level to sort of remind leaders at the institutional level, if you like, that they need to invest in this from rather than just putting money in at the N8 level or support at the N8, what they can do to unlock some of these opportunities locally. And I don't know if you've any thoughts on that from a Manchester perspective, what would help?
What would help? I mean, I think Colette is really, I mean, she meets with us regularly. She wants to know what we're doing. Yeah, I think it would be nice to have you saying similar things from higher up about the need for funding, so we can bring people together. You know, even just money just to pay for coffee and biscuits would go down relatively well, because it just gives people an incentive to come along, as well as talk about their research. They're actually engaging in a social activity too. So yeah, that would be helpful. It's just I mean, it's not that we're asking for a lot of money initially. It's just something that would enable us to start bringing people together and get those collaborations more underway.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. So thanks both. I'm going to say that's a really useful view from Manchester about where things stand. So thanks for that. So moving on now, we've got our next presentations from Neil Humphrey, who is Professor of Psychology of Education and head of the Manchester Institute of Education and has been since 2016. Neil's research interests include social and emotional learning, mental health, and special educational needs. So it says here. I'm sure Neil will tell us much more right now. Over to you, Neil.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Just a very minor correction. I've not been head of MIE for just over 2 years now.
Oh, apologies.
It's okay, no worries, it's fine. Yeah, our current head of MIE is a chap called Steve Jones, who does a very good job indeed. I did 4 years, which is more than enough. So yeah, so I'll share my screen if that's okay. Hang on. My little PowerPoint slides. So as Steve said, so I'm Neil Humphrey. I'm the Sarah Fielding Professor of Psychology of Education in the Manchester Institute of Education in the University of Manchester. I'm going to talk to you briefly, just to give you a little bit of an overview of the Be Well programme and what we've been trying to do in GM to make young people's wellbeing everybody's business. The first thing that I will do, which I'll probably do at least 2 or 3 times, is to flag our website, www.gmbewell.org. Flagging that in particular because there's a lot of information about Be Well on there, way more than I can give you in the next sort of 10 minutes or so, but also some of the tools and resources that I'm going to talk about, and particularly our wellbeing dashboard, which is publicly available, is housed within that website. So just to say a little bit about what Be Well is. So Be Well is a wellbeing programme led by the university, the Anna Freud National Centre for Children and Families, the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, and the Gregson Family Foundation. In a nutshell, well, our strapline says it best: we want to make young people's wellbeing everybody's business. We were developing the idea for what became Be Well prior to the pandemic, and the pandemic has only kind of strengthened our resolve in terms of focusing on young people's wellbeing. The project itself combines sort of academic expertise from the team that I lead, from colleagues at the Anna Freud Centre, with youth-led change. So everything that I'll describe to you has involved extensive consultation with young people, from the focus of the surveys that we conduct once a year, to what we do with the data, to the things that happen as a result of the data. Basically everything that we do, there is a process of extensive consultation that happens with young people. So very much about youth-led change. Therefore the programme itself is very much designed by young people. It's by young people for young people. The backbone of it is an annual survey looking at the different aspects of young people's wellbeing and the things that they have told us drive their wellbeing. We focus on young people in secondary schools across Greater Manchester, particularly. A question I'm quite often asked is, are you going to do anything in primary schools or in FE? And the answer is yes, when we get the bandwidth and headspace to do so. We decided we wanted to start with secondary schools, primarily actually because that's the time in young people's lives when most of the data tells us, you know, if you're ever going to experience mental health difficulties in your lifetime, the first onset is during secondary school for most people. So we decided that would be a good place to start, but then obviously we can look younger and we can look older as we go along. We are wanting to amplify young people's voices, work together for change and celebrate young people's wellbeing. So it's not just about highlighting problems with young people's mental health and wellbeing. Some of the basics then. So in terms of the data that we've gathered, we had our first annual survey last year. Second annual survey is underway right now. Last year, we got data from just under 40,000 young people aged 12 to 15. So that's over half of all young people in that age bracket in Greater Manchester. So it went from being essentially from being a survey to pretty much being a census. We're working with most of the secondary schools in Greater Manchester. So we had about 165, I think, schools that participated last year out of the sort of 250 or so secondary schools across Greater Manchester. And that includes mainstream, special schools, PRUs, APs and the like, all 10 local authorities of GM. And the survey sample, the young people that responded, their composition mirrors very, very closely, as you would expect, given that it's more than half of that population, the population of the GM young people aged 11 to 16. So very similar in terms of gender balance, very similar in terms of special needs, ethnicity, free school meal eligibility, and so on and so forth. So one of the key things that we have confidence in then is our ability to kind of extrapolate from our survey findings to what we think is going on in the population for young people. In terms of what we actually survey young people on, we look at different domains of well-being, which we've kind of clustered into three areas. Young people's sense of meaning, purpose and control. So this includes things like their sense of autonomy and agency, their hopes and aspirations for the future. Something that we call understanding yourself, which is things like their self-esteem, their ability to manage their emotions, their mental well-being, and then emotions. So both positive emotions, joy, happiness, etc., but also negative, difficult, challenging emotions, sadness, worry, and the things that we normally kind of talk about when we talk about internalizing mental health difficulties. And then we also survey, young people in terms of the drivers of their well-being. So again, this is all based, remember, on what young people have told us matters to them. So we survey them on their health and routines, so their perception of their physical health, the things that they do on a day-to-day basis in terms of sleep and exercise and so on. Their hobbies and entertainment, you know, how are they spending their free time and how satisfied are they with what's available to them for them to do in their free time. Their relationships with other young people, with their parents, with school staff, with, you know, people in their kind of social worlds. School, as you would expect, which is a kind of a central feature for adolescents. And then what we call environment and society, which is broadly speaking is about their local area, their local environment, their neighborhood, and what's going on there, how safe do they feel, those kinds of things. And then finally their future, what do they think about their hopes and aspirations for the future. And that final bit integrates with work that was already going on in GM in relation to the kind of life readiness campaign. So the Mayor's campaign around supporting young people so they are ready for the world beyond school in an adult life. So having gathered all that data, this isn't, I keep emphasizing with people, Be Well isn't just a survey, it's actually the survey generates data that we then use to try and create positive change. So we gather all this data, nearly 40,000 young people from over 160 schools. We then have to put that data to work. And so what we do is a few things. One is we have interactive aggregated data dashboards. We have two dashboards that are used by our schools, so they get aggregated data fed back to them with intuitive visualizations and different kind of filters and things, so they can interrogate the data for their school against the backdrop of other schools in GM and particularly statistical neighbours, so other schools that look similar to their own. And we have a main dashboard and then a dashboard particularly that focuses on the life readiness issues that I mentioned earlier. The second data dashboard, the one that's publicly available, that's on our website, is a neighbourhood dashboard. So Greater Manchester is spread into 67 different geographic units that are referred to as the GM neighbourhoods. And because we have young people's residential postcodes as part of the data that we hold for the project, we can place their responses in any one of those 67 neighbourhoods. So we have essentially a heat map of young people's wellbeing across Greater Manchester. And again, it's interactive and you can apply different filters and things so that you can kind of get more and more granular data. And we use different metrics for different providers and so on. And then we also do these what we call themed analyses. So just to give you an example, we're using the whole data set to earlier this year we did an inequalities analysis where we were looking at wellbeing inequalities in key metrics for different socio-demographic subgroups, including gender diverse and sexual minority young people with special educational needs, young people with different ethnic backgrounds and so on. So we publish these analyses, publish the data dashboards, and then we have a community of different partners. So we have all the schools that are involved, we have neighbourhoods and community organisations, the Combined Authority, the Child Outcomes Research Consortium who support our schools, and about 100 and something now, probably about 120 or so coalition partners who are organisations that have committed to acting on the data that we produce. And they can be anything from kind of hyper-local community organisations to some of the big service providers and anywhere in between. So 42nd Street, for example, who people who know Manchester will know well. The Timpson Group, who are our big employer in the Northwest, and all kinds of different organisations who then can use the dashboard data to effect change. And the idea here is the data is producing actionable insights. And I'll give you some key examples of things that have happened directly as a result of the Be Well data and our analyses in a second. But it's really about building an evidence base that can inform decision-making and provision across a system which has lacked this kind of large-scale data covering young people's well-being and the drivers of their well-being. So we gather all this data, we produce it in accessible formats for our different partners, and they can then use it to make decisions about changes within the system to support young people's well-being. What that looks like in terms of concrete examples, I'll give you three. So the first one we're calling A Place to Be Well, and this is about how our analysis looking at how young people's, how place matters basically, so neighbourhood effects on young people's well-being. So we've done a series of analyses, and in fact we've got another one going on at the moment which Pam and myself and a couple of other colleagues are involved with, which is looking at how place impacts on young people's loneliness. But we've got work that's already been done that looks at how it impacts on their well-being and their mental health difficulties. We've got the kind of strand of work that we're calling Proud to Be Well, which is looking at young people who are gender diverse, sexual minority young people who referred to as LGBTQ+, and the inequalities that we've observed in well-being for those young people compared to their peers, and a whole strand of work that's emerged from that Ola, that you'll hear from a little bit later, is leading a new project on that, but basically work around young people who are LGBTQ+. And then finally, another example, Move to Be Well, which is about what the data is telling us about young people's physical activity and exercise and how that might connect to their mental health. So the Place to Be Well one has led directly to a social prescribing pilot, something that we're calling Be Well Champions. So in five GM neighbourhoods where our data is showing particular issues around community connection and well-being, there's a social prescribing pilot that's being delivered in and through schools in those neighbourhoods to try and help young people feel more connected and to feel more supported within their communities. In terms of Proud to Be Well, the data and the analyses in relation to the inequalities that we highlighted in our analyses earlier this year has led to the Health and Social Care Partnership, or as they're now called, the ICB, I think they're now called. They've set aside a youth-led commissioning pot. So they've ring-fenced money specifically for support for wellbeing among young people who are part of the LGBTQ plus community, but importantly that it's young people led, so they are the ones that are making the decisions around how that money should be spent. And also the Proud Trust working with ourselves with the project that Ola is leading, are pioneering some work on that, and have made some changes in terms of I think they've employed a new trans youth worker, partly as a result of some of what our data is showing. And then finally, in terms of Move to Be Well, in terms of the kind of physical activity, there's a number of physical activity campaigns. So Greater Manchester Moving, when we published our headline findings, they launched or are launching a physical activity campaign, because our data showed that only 1 in 3 young people were meeting or exceeding the chief medical officer's recommended amount of daily exercise, and particularly it's an issue for girls. So they launched a physical activity campaign earlier this year, and we've just in the last few weeks, the Youth Sport Trust are doing some new campaign work around a new physical activity and mental health intervention, whose name now escapes me, which I knew it would, and I should have written it down, but it will come back to me. But we've helped the Youth Sport Trust, then again, coming back to the data, what this little visualization shows is we mapped our data in terms of physical activity scores and mental well-being, and this lower quadrant that I've highlighted are the schools where there are the lowest physical activity levels and the lowest well-being scores. And so we're helping the Youth Sports Trust to target schools where the young people might benefit most from this physical activity intervention that they're developing to work with schools. So in all these cases, the data and the analysis is leading directly to concrete change on the ground. We're kind of keeping a little bit of a running total. We called it our quick wins folder. It's no longer quick wins because it's now 6 months plus since we actually launched some of the dashboards. But since the dashboards were launched, there's been over £600,000 investment in initiatives launched in direct response to the Be Well data. And that's just the stuff that we know about. We're hearing about other things happening all the time where people are they don't always tell us until they're already doing it. So there's lots and lots of activity on the ground, and we want to kind of see that grow. That's a very quick whistle stop tour. The final thing I'll say before I hand over for any questions is we are on pretty much every social media platform. You can email us. We're on Twitter. We're on Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok, you name it. So whatever your social media preference, you'll find a Be Well presence. So please do connect with us. And I will leave it there.
Many thanks, Neil. That's brilliant. I mean, that's really inspiring to see sort of how that data collection can sort of snowball so quickly into other activities. And it's just that that figure of 600K that it's already sort of leveraged in terms of other things is fantastic. Has anybody got any questions for Neil about any of that? Pam?
Yeah, sorry, I had to put my physical hand up. I seem to have lost all of the little emoticon type things. All I wanted to say, Neil, was it's so impressive. I mean, what an amazing ref impact statement you're going to have. Sorry, I just when I was listening to it, I thought, oh yeah, got that sorted already.
I'm aiming to have the ref impact case study written by Christmas.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, no, fab, absolutely fab stuff. And I know from talking with people across GM that this whole project is so exciting for people. The young people are just loving it. But so many initiatives are coming off it because people are really engaged. So, well done. It's fab. Really good.
Thank you.
Anyone else? I mean, the one thing I was going to ask is obviously, a lot of the issues that are being thrown up by this are obviously not unique to GM by any means. And are you already considering ways that some of this data can be put to use elsewhere across the north and beyond?
We are, yeah. And in fact, so our kind of initial plan was, GM is basically the proof of concept for this kind of program. And we kind of knew, well, we didn't know, we kind of guessed we would get the traction in GM because, we've got a mayor that is deeply committed to young people, because we had relationships with schools and local authorities and so on. Basically, the system was ready. But we're now in the process of looking at basically scaling out. So the real acid test is running it in a second area where we don't have all those connections, where the political leanings are different. So we're in the process of looking at branching out into a second area, which we're hopefully going to have news on maybe this side of Christmas, but in the early new year. And in the meantime, separately, we've got kind of developing relationships with individual local authorities up and down the country. So there's a handful of local authorities that have, you know, they've heard about what we're doing on the grapevine and said, oh, well, actually, we'd like to do a version of this. And what we're currently thinking through is basically like, you know, different versions of what Be Well might look like, depending on the level of resource and commitment that's available. But there's certainly a significant amount of interest. The kind of vision is some kind of national system where, you know, we're routinely kind of gathering large scale data on young people's well-being and the things that influence their well-being, so that on the ground, wherever you are in the country, there is the data available to know what to support, how to support it, where to support it. You know, it's this vacuum of data that we've had up until now that I think has been the challenge. Is, you know, we've decided initiatives based on intuition or anecdote rather than actually what kind of large scale quality data is telling us. So yeah, in a few years maybe we'll be national, but we'll see. We're trying to walk before we can run.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I guess the investment in something this size shows the real power of doing that kind of routine data collection, as you say. So I think it makes a really strong case for rolling it out more widely. Brilliant. If there's no more questions for Neil, we will move on to the next presentation. Thanks, Neil. So at risk of getting other people's titles and job titles wrong, I'll keep this very simple. Our next presentation from Stephanie Gillibrand, who is a research fellow in the Centre for Primary Care in the School of Health Sciences, and Sam Khavandi, who is a research associate in health economics. Over to you two.
Thanks, Steve. Let me share my screen. Hopefully not have any issues. Is that sharing for everyone? Okay, well, hello everyone. Thanks for your time. Stephanie and I will be presenting some work that we've been doing alongside Luke Mumford and Matt Sutton, as well as many other authors and colleagues at other institutes. And this is all kind of fed into a wider collective of work with the NIHR and the NHSA. I'm going to start by going over some of the socioeconomic and health inequalities faced before the COVID-19 pandemic, and as well as after the pandemic. And Stephanie is going to talk a bit about the impacts of these on the children. So as I just mentioned, this will be some of the work that we've done for some of the NHSA reports, and they're kind of based around the theme of COVID-19. And the following slides I'll present, or we'll be presenting, are some kind of a whistle-stop tour of these 4 reports, and essentially a kind of a highlights reel of them. I'll start by going over the stark inequalities that we saw existing before the COVID-19 pandemic, and the scope of these will be looking at a regional level. So one thing we know is that a large factor in health and socioeconomic inequalities is deprivation, and high levels of deprivation are strongly associated with socioeconomic and health outcomes. And what we find is that the levels of deprivation across the country are actually unequally distributed. And these maps kind of highlight that. So we've used IMD, the Index of Multiple Deprivation, as a measure for deprivation. And we set them out by local authority districts and LSOAs, which are a slightly smaller geographical level. And here we can kind of see that unequal distribution, where on the maps we're seeing darker shades of red representing high levels of deprivation. And we can clearly see that there's a lot of darker shading of red up in the northern areas of the country, but as well as the southwest, mainly the coastal areas, and also London has a lot of dark shaded red areas, but we kind of like to think of London as its own microcosm. And another map, I think I quite like this one. I think it's quite a nice image, not in terms of what it's showing in terms of results, but more the perspective and the method of it. So what we're looking at is the railway network, the main lines across the country. And here we're seeing life expectancy and the variations of it. So what we see is that as we move more north, the life expectancy actually decreases below and drops below the national average. And that's for both males and for females as well. And then again, when we look at life expectancy, but this time over a time span, so over the past few decades, what we're finding is that there is a gap between the north and the south and the rest of England. Again, for males and females, and in more recent years, these gaps have been growing, and there's no signs of them kind of closing, sadly. And it's particularly the case when we look at left behind areas and neighbourhoods, as seen on the graphs on the right hand side of the screen. And this left behind areas work is something, and the analysis is something that Stephanie's going to touch on a little bit at the end of our presentation today. So looking at socioeconomic inequalities, we find that, well, we've used gross value added as a measure for productivity. And we've looked at the trends between different regions. And what we see is that productivity in the north is much lower than the rest of England. And on the right side of the bar charts, we can see even the growth of productivity in the north is less, so it's growing at a slower rate. And to put this into real terms, when we calculated it, we see that this gap kind of equates to around £44 billion per year. So these are massive figures we're talking about. And to figure out where these were coming from, the differences, we did look into and explore the productivity and what was causing the stark differences. And what we found is health contributes to about 30% of this. And when we break that down further, we can see that morbidity is about 17% and mortality is about 13% of a contributor to these differences in productivity levels between North and the rest of England. And then continuing with productivity again, here we've looked at mental health and the relationship between mental health and productivity. What we find is that when mental health worsens, as does productivity, and therefore having this gap between the north and the rest of England in this productivity gap, we find we can kind of make these assumptions and associations that mental health could also be affected. And this is an important link because we know mental health inequalities do exist, and they are unequally distributed, sadly, across the country. But it's not only at a regional level of distribution in that it's unequal, it's also between age groups as well. So we did some exploring earlier on in the year looking at mental health poverty. So using a poverty measure, which you have financial poverty or fuel poverty, but applying it to mental health, where individuals below a certain threshold, we class them as being in a mental health poverty. And these are done by age groups in these graphs. So in the top left graph, we've done overall health. So that's mental health and physical health. And we see that as expected, as age groups get older, the experience of health poverty increases. But on the right side, on the right graph and the bottom left, we've looked at two different measures of mental health. Using GHQ and the SF12 mental component, so using two different measures, and we find that the younger age groups tend to experience mental health poverty, and these trends have been growing over the past few years. And this kind of links in with what Stephanie was talking about later on in the presentation. So those were the quick going over what was going on before the pandemic, and then now we're going to transition into what the outcomes were during the COVID-19 panic. And of course, sadly, inequalities did not go away. In fact, we did find that they were exacerbated. And this was highlighted when we look at mortality rates. So in these graphs, we're showing the COVID-19 mortality rates for counties and metropolitan areas. We've got the English average there, just under 200, and we've got all these other areas, mainly in the north areas, which do tend to experience or did experience worse COVID-19 mortality rates. And one of the greatest ones being in Greater Manchester, which had a difference of up to 38% higher mortality than the England average. And again, it's a similar story, sadly, with mental health as well, whereby the north experienced worse mental health. And during the lockdown, which are represented by those dotted lines, we can see that for the rest of England, there was a slight spike where mental health did seem to improve, but this wasn't the case in the north. And again, there's many factors contributing to this. And We did highlight the reference to lockdowns in that last graph because this was a significant period in most people's lives, which impacted them differently. And again, we explored this as well to see what the inequalities were between the North and the rest of England in lockdown levels. So on the left, we can see an average trend of where 4 represents the harsher levels of lockdown and 0 is no lockdowns. We can see that the North, compared to the rest of England, did experience on average high levels of lockdown. And then on the right, we're looking at the breakdowns of these by region. So we're again seeing that the northern areas did spend more time in the more stricter levels of lockdown. And again, these can impact, the levels of lockdown impacted all sorts of life, from going to work and socializing, as well as school closures and the socializing of children as well. So that kind of leads me on to handing over to Stephanie to talk a bit more about that.
Thanks very much, Sam. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a bit about the mental health of primary school children during the pandemic. Can I have the next slide, please?
So there's a slight delay, I think. Okay, is that right?
Thank you. Oh, so just to go back a bit, this is kind of the picture with children and poverty and the kind of the run up to the COVID-19 pandemic. So in the North, we know that nearly 1/3 of children live in poverty. Nearly 60% of local authorities in the northern regions have above average levels of children in low-income families. And of course, this is off the back of about 10 or so years of austerity, with more widespread cuts to children's services in the north of England, and the North disproportionately affected by children in the North disproportionately affected by these austerity cuts. And this is obviously important because child poverty has a long-term effect on children's development, health and well-being, and anticipated pandemic increase in child poverty is deeply worrying and kind of sets the scene for the future. With this area-based deprivation is obviously really strong, and as Sam just talked about, and we know that there's a strong intersection with sociodemographics, and alongside that, so makeup in terms of ethnicity and area-based deprivation. So 1 in 5 children in the North are from an ethnic minoritized background, and are more likely to live in a deprived area than children from ethnic minority groups from the rest of England. Next slide, please. So using the data from the coast-based data set, which was taken by our colleagues at University of Oxford, we tracked some of the mental health symptoms for primary school children during the COVID-19 pandemic. So you may recognise these graphs as from the Child of the North report, and so we use the measure of strengths and difficulties questionnaire. So this is a measures of that have measures of behaviour, emotional problems, conduct, and it's reported by the parent on behalf of the child. So we controlled for age, family income, and special educational needs status of children. And if we look at these graphs, if we look at the one on the right first, then we can see that figure 4.3. So this looks at average SDQ scores, and on the x-axis you've got each month from March 2020 to May 2021. And the lockdown periods are marked with these vertical red lines. So you can see the period where the regional lockdowns were in place from about August 2020 to January 2021, at which point the UK went into a full national lockdown, second national lockdown, England that is. So if we look at this, the kind of key moments to pick out is that mental health symptoms steadily increased. So the higher scores on the axis indicate worse mental health symptoms. They steadily increased during the lockdown, first lockdown, March to June, spiking in that June period. At which point schools reopened, and then we see this period where they kind of fall quite steadily until October 2020, where they tend to go up again. And at this point, COVID rates were increasing, and we were heading into that winter that really bad winter with COVID rates ahead of the second national lockdown. And again, you can see this spike again in the February, which is in that height of the second national lockdown. So looking at the kind of the gender and the north differentials here, we can see that male in the north of England consistently have higher or worse mental health symptoms during this period. And it's consistently higher for girls, and rest of England boys is quite similar as well, followed by female north of England as well. So if we look at the graph on the left as well, this shows us, this is actually something that we didn't include in the report, but this has the higher SDQ scores. So this would be typically for people who are already expressing worse mental health symptoms. So this is a marginal increase of scores above 17 on SDQ levels. So we can see these broadly kind of similar patterns for gender split and for the regional differences as well. But it is much more volatile, and we can see from October onwards the rates kind of increase quite dramatically. And then during the national lockdowns as well from January onwards as well. So that's potentially something to explore more, that volatility with people with worse mental health issues. Next slide, please. So this was also included in our chapter on the report, and this is some work that Pam did around the eating disorders and prevalence of mental health disorders, prevalence of mental health disorders for girls between 2017 and 2020. So we can see here that in the graphs on the left, that there are prevalence for steeper increases for Yorkshire and the northwest compared to 2017. Compared to the southern regions, those increases are much steeper. And the same for boys as well. And then if we look at the loneliness measures as well, so this is figure 4.4, it's the percentage of parents who were reported that they were or a child were lonely, and we can see that the north has also worse outcomes in that respect as well. So final slide, please. Oh, and the education and the earnings impact. So this is some analysis done by Luke and our colleague Rose around documenting how or analysing how these impacts to education and mental health may impact on earnings over the course of the lifetime. So they've done some analysis again that the North will have a greater reduction for the loss of earnings for children as a result of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Final slide, please. So I've just put here some areas for future research, which I think is going to preempt the discussion later, but I thought it was a kind of a neat way to tie this all off, because this analysis was obviously done during the pandemic, and now we're kind of in that period after where maybe this is quite a pertinent time to reflect on where we can move forward with all of this. So in terms of longitudinal regional analysis of mental health impacts for children and young people, we know that there was a lot of research done during the pandemic, but that was quite snapshot based in that pandemic period. So the longitudinal assessment of that would be really important, and I think this is going to tie nicely onto what Ola will talk about. And the longitudinal assessment of regional productivity losses. So we know that the climate that children and young people will go into in terms of their earnings and their education and future job opportunities is going to be really important. And this is some of the work that Sam and Luke are looking at in terms of impacts of that. And the longitudinal assessment of educational outcomes as well. So, we know there was huge disruptions to children's education during the pandemic, but we'll probably be, in this period coming up that we may see, we've started to see some of that impact, but how that's going to play out long term will be really important, particularly thinking about the differences, the regional differences that we've seen in mental health from this analysis. And then overlying all this context is, of course, the cost of living crisis, impacts to public sector. I don't want to preempt the budget too much, but it looks like, putting my political economist hat on, it looks like we're going to be going to a period of more austerity. We know that there was increased demand for child and adolescent mental health services during the pandemic. So we might have increased demand, but limited financial capacity to support that. And of course, whatever happens in the household or any external pressures to the household, for example, interest rates rise, all of that context will inevitably have really important implications for children and young people in those households. And then, of course, related to the policy agenda, what does all of this mean long term for levelling up and the achievability of that strategy? And I will leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Stephanie, and thanks, Sam. That's a really useful and really sobering overview of some of the impacts during the pandemic on mental health, and particularly on children as well. Are there any questions for Sam and Stephanie? There's a hand up there. Is it
it's Kasia. Yes. Hi. It's a very quick question to Sam, really. Just going back to your pie chart on productivity, you highlighted that 30% of productivity was affected by health, and there was a big field of 60% of other factors. Would you be able to just give us a few biggest ones within that group?
Yes. So the other factors include the examples of, say, deprivation. That was a massive one. I haven't got the exact breakdowns of that off the top of my head, but deprivation, so the differences in gender as well. So these common confounders that we could kind of think of fell into that other category there. Hence why it's so big. It's just they've compiled, but yeah, unfortunately, I've not got the breakdown of it to describe.
Yes, okay. So I presume education and quality of education would be one of them as well.
Yes, that would be.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think we particularly or specifically looked at that, but that would be a great one to look at. Yeah, that would definitely have an impact there.
Okay, thank you.
Caroline.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie and Sam. That was a really interesting and, as you said, Steve, sobering set of statistics. I was curious about that analysis at the end about the lifetime kind of cost of COVID on earnings and things like that, and I just wondered what some of the factors might be as to why there's that differential between the north and other parts of the country.
Yeah, I mean, I will do a bit of a cop-out answer to that, because that wasn't my bit of the analysis. But what I will say is, I think it's, we know that the north suffered hugely, more greatly in terms of economic losses. So that will be a massive impact factor for it, in terms of the climate, that the economic climate, and as a result of that. So I think that's probably one of the greatest drivers of that.
Thank you.
Pam, did you have your hand up before? Do you want to ask something?
Yeah, I was just interested really in some of the statistics seem to show that it wasn't just about the north-south divide, but also gender seemed to be quite important as well. And I think sometimes we forget about those individual differences that might be really important. So I found that quite useful to see, as a reminder more than anything else.
Yeah, and I think I glossed over it a bit because of time, but I think it's really key when you see that, the boys in the rest of England, their scores were really bad as well, but with the females in the north of England, and then you start to have some kind of interesting differentials there, and I think it is, and that's when we're talking about interdisciplinary research, that kind of intersectionality approach of how all these things interact differently for different genders and regions, I think is something we should be really conscious of as a research group going forward.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because I think that's missing from so much research, in different disciplines, and being able to offer that, because we're coming together, I think is a really good idea. Yeah, we can offer that very specialist perspective. Yeah, thanks very much. I thought it was really interesting.
Great, thanks both. I have to say that it's very concerning thinking of what we know already about the impact of a decade of austerity on particularly children in the north, and we know, as Stephanie pointed out, that we're going to get another dose of austerity by the looks of it, and the current cost of living crisis and how that might exacerbate what's already gone on during COVID. So yeah, it's very worrying times, unfortunately. Moving on to our next presentation, that's from Ola Demkowicz, who is a lecturer in the psychology of education, again at the Manchester Institute of Education. And Ola, I think you're going to talk to us about adolescent mental health.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, so, it looked like I'd frozen on my screen then, but hopefully you can all see and hear me. I might be, I suppose the thing I will say before I get to presenting on our findings today is very much, this is very rough and ready as a presentation because we've had findings for about 10 days. So this is very much sort of formative analysis that I'm picking up here, that we're still making sense of. And I will also say, as my cop-out, as Steph put it, I was not the analyst on this. Matthias Pearce, who's not with us today because he has a big deadline today, completed the analysis on this, including using an approach that I haven't done myself. So there may be points where you have a question and I say, it's a great question, but I don't know the answer. So this is my best go at presenting analysis that Matthias finished for me a week ago, is basically what I'm doing today. But really, really interesting analysis that sits interestingly, and I had a chat with Pam about sharing this data because actually it sits quite differently alongside some of the things that we're picking up on, and I think there's really, really interesting kind of reasons around that. So let me share my screen. So if I do that, can you see my screen? And it's a presentation and not a Word document. Okay, perfect, thank you. I always worry with presentations of what it's going to do. So yeah, I'm presenting on very kind of formative analysis from Understanding Society. As I said, Matthias Pearce has done the analysis on this and been kind of leading on this. And we've also had feeding from Emily Banwell and Steph, who's here now, and we're sharing this with a wider set of colleagues over the next couple of weeks as we start to finish drafting things. Steph, this may be the first time you hear of these findings because it's just been me and Matthias going, oh, this is weird, isn't it, about the findings. So Steph's name is here, but I realized that I only sent this to you like last night. So yeah, we were quite interested generally in lots of different aspects. So the work we've been doing isn't specifically about region, but we have folded region in, and there is some interesting findings kind of generally and in relation to region. So thinking about, COVID and place, I almost don't need to say these things because we've just been talking about it so much, but this kind of stuff around how we think of what COVID meant in different areas of the country and how we think about that. So that idea of having, tiers at various points and really varied restrictions in place, but as well as, even when restrictions were similar, sometimes the way that plays out in different regions is going to look really different, as we've seen in some of the presentations today. And interestingly, in some of the different bits of work that have linked specifically to mental health, both generally and in relation to young people's mental health, lots of studies haven't found significant differences between regions, and then some studies, as similarly ones we've picked up today, have. So there's quite a mixed picture around this. Now that reflects a wider mixed picture that we're seeing at the moment just around adolescent mental health and COVID. There's lots of really mixed evidence around the extent of impact and sort of what that impact looked like at different points in the pandemic, and it's quite tricky to navigate at the moment. And so whenever we talk about the impact of COVID on youth mental health, it's actually really hard to produce a single answer that can, and there is never a single answer, I think, is always a thing, but there's a lot of complexity around actually, do we think of this as a worsening of mental health, or do we think of this as a short period of temporary distress that was really a normal and healthy reaction to everything being tipped upside down, which I think always resonates with me when I think about that period. And I think often with adults, it wasn't just young people, though they experienced really particular ways of things being turned upside down. But actually, so perhaps do we think of some of those dips in mental health that we see as maybe being sort of short-term reactions, is some of the evidence that's sort of being pointed to there. as well as thinking about actually where might there be more long-term impact for particular groups. So yeah, there's also then lots of limitations in that mixed picture that's emerging in some of the data. So some of that is around sampling. There's been a lot of convenience sampling of sort of, well, who's available and willing to do this is a really key component of actually lots of the data that we've been able to work with. That's really problematic because it might be telling us about particular pockets of the population in all kinds of ways. There's also issues around who's completing. So lots of studies have used parent report, for instance, when it comes to adolescent mental health. And that's quite tricky because it's not necessarily that it's less accurate, because I think there's a big push recently, you know, in the last few years to recognise that it's not that young people are necessarily more accurate in reporting their mental health, but that it's a different perspective. But there is definitely a kind of component of actually, you know, parents were really worried during COVID, and they were also spending more time with their children. And so perhaps the way that they were thinking about and reporting on that mental health might have been quite different. And another really key issue, not present in all the studies, but definitely present in a lot, is not having kind of pre-pandemic data or even not having kind of multiple waves of that pre-pandemic data. That means that it's difficult to kind of account for what was happening before the pandemic for any young person, but also to kind of pinpoint actually how that change might have been happening over time already in some respects. So even having one kind of pre-pandemic time point isn't necessarily always that helpful in pinpointing what the change is. So with all of those things in mind, as part of a wider body of Child of the North work, we'd set out to kind of think about, well, actually, how might we look at some of the data sets that are available and think about how we try and address some of those things. And a few of us ended up looking at the Understanding Society dataset. So many of you may well be familiar, but essentially this is a dataset it's the UK Household Longitudinal Study, also called Understanding Society, and it's a randomly selected national cohort dataset, and there's all kinds of kind of available features around things like weighting that can be used to really make sure that that is and can be supported to be representative when we're kind of analysing data, to think about actually how can we make that group kind of reflect the wider population. Again, Matthias led on weighting in a very fancy way. He gave me a very long talk about how like often people weight it wrong. I have no idea what he was talking about, but he was very convincing about the need to weight it very carefully. So I trust what he did here, but I'm not sure what he did. And there's a pocket of this data with 11 to 15-year-olds where there are data collection waves before the pandemic, as well as data collection waves across the pandemic. And I want to really draw attention here to the dates, which if you look at them, July 2020, November 2020 and March 2021, these are not at the worst points of restrictions. And now that what that doesn't allow us to do here is look at how did, you know, intense lockdowns affect young people. But actually, we've got lots of data looking at intense lockdown periods, because that was when people were being very proactive. Not that people weren't being, but that was when there was a really big push to, like, you know, get that data, really understand what was happening in those points. What's interesting here, and what we wanted to kind of look at here, is actually this almost allows us to look across that period in a way that isn't about things being highly restricted. It isn't about things being really tight and intense. It's sort of, in my head, it's almost like we skate across those points. We just sort of like bump across them, and we're looking at across that pandemic period, but we're not necessarily dipping into, okay, when was it the worst, in that sense. So we have approximately 6,000 participants. Again, approximately is because we're still drafting things and Matthias has information. But my understanding is we have just over 6,000 young people as a total sample. Obviously, bits of analysis might kind of vary. 11 to 15-year-olds. I believe we've essentially included anybody who sits in that time point at some time. I think it's that they've completed at least one before the pandemic and one during the pandemic. Again, as with anything, I might not be quite right on that. If Matthias was here, I'm sure he'd correct me, but my understanding is they just needed to have completed one measure at any time point. So some of those might have been at their younger age and just coming in as partway through that, or some of them might be older and have kind of headed out. Any young person who's responded to at least one survey since 2015, actually. So is what Matthias has in the paper there. But we have we chose to look particularly at strengths and difficulties questionnaire. Again, when we did weighing up around that, because there is also more kind of diagnostic level mental health data available, we wanted to stick with this idea of kind of the SDQ being more symptom level and what we could conceptualize as being more kind of everyday functioning of mental health at a community level. And we wanted to look at that given the kinds of things we talked about before of how we actually think about that mental health impact as being quite complex. And so the SDQ is broken down into emotional problems, conduct problems, hyperactivity and inattention, peer relationship problems, and pro-social. I've popped a little asterisk next to peer relationship problems. We're currently doing some further analysis just of kind of how stable that is over time. Matthias is looking at that later this week. I suspect one of the items is I am alone a lot of the time. So it's sort of like, well, that question before lockdowns and that question across a pandemic is not the same question that we're asking. And so we're looking at actually how do we report on that aspect of the analysis, and actually is it appropriate to be even including analysis like that, because it might indicate a change where actually there isn't one. So we're looking at sort of item level behavior over those time points at the moment, just to try and unpack that a little bit more so we can think about how to report on that. And then analysis. So our kind of core question was, did symptoms worsen following the start of the pandemic? So as I said, the region was not the kind of core focus in this piece, but we wanted to know kind of general mean SDQ change, but we also wanted to know about particular pockets of the SDQ, what the SDQ captures, as well as looking actually across groups and thinking about the kinds of vulnerabilities that we've seen coming out in that evidence elsewhere, and actually looking at, are those happening here when we think about that change? And so what we did here was, or what Matthias did here, was calculate mean SDQ scores for each half year before the pandemic, and then each COVID survey, those 3 waves that have been done with young people that took part in that component since the pandemic. And Matthias then fitted generalized estimating equations to those repeated measures to examine COVID's influence. So the idea was that we were looking at sort of pre and post, was there a change over that point? There's lots more complicated analytic information, but I didn't want to kind of go into that too heavily. But essentially it's that thing of, has it worsened from that kind of starting point? And then we looked at whether or not some of those are differed by subgroups, and that included region. So this is our kind of core analytic point. I just wanted to share these before I get into region, which is essentially, if you look, this is this red line being when COVID happened, and you can see these are the kind of various waves that were available, the time points that were available prior to COVID, with young people, you know, being 11 to 15 and various points of that. And then this is the young, you know, the data that we have for those who took part in those 3 waves after, like, across the pandemic. And say after COVID, but it's not after the start of COVID as a pandemic. And you can see that there's already a creeping up prior to the pandemic. And what we essentially saw statistically was that there was no significant difference at the overall mean SDQ level before and after the pandemic. So there was no meaningful difference. And I think when you look at it, you can sort of see why that might be in terms of this kind of uptick that was already happening prior to the pandemic, compared to kind of earlier waves of their data. And then we also looked at them by subscale. So again, these sort of stay fairly, you can see pro-social is higher up because it's a positively worded SDQ domain. But you can see across these kind of that they do sort of stay pretty steady looking. You can see, I mean, I find it really interesting, although it dips, conduct to me looks like it's dipping, which is interesting with thinking about actually things like school closures, maybe. But again, the only statistically significant change here was in peer, and it was a small worsening of peer problems. Again, we're now looking at how do we report on that, because I don't think that's a genuine change. I don't think we can trust that that's a genuine change in how a young person is relating to their peers, beyond the fact that they maybe weren't able to as much. And that's quite messy. So we're digging into that more at the moment. So we also looked across, various groups. We looked around kind of gender, ethnicity. We looked at things like urban versus rural areas. But we also looked at region. Now, we didn't just do North and South. This isn't just English data. We had North, Midlands and South. And then we had Northern Ireland and Scotland and Wales as well. And essentially, when we looked across those, there were no statistically significant differences across the regions of the UK when you're looking at kind of total SDQ scores. And when you think about that, you know, we knew that we weren't seeing kind of whole group differences in that, but we did want to hone in on particular groups because there is that suggestion that actually it's not problematic for everybody, but it is problematic for some, is what's come out of the wider evidence. We haven't found any differences for anybody. And I think what that really speaks to is perhaps the timing of when we collected, or what, not when we collected data, but what that data relates to, of that kind of idea of it's skating across the worst points of the pandemic in terms of what actually the disruption to daily life that was caused. So we're not seeing regional differences that are significant coming through in that work. And I think taking away from that, I mean, it's really interesting in thinking about how we think about how COVID has impacted youth mental health or not. And whether or not we've all been worried about something that either we didn't need to worry about or that we should have already been worried about prior to the pandemic. And this is now just an additional backdrop of what young people have been needing to navigate. I suspect it's a bit of the latter really for me, I think. And I do think this does sit counter to many of the things that have been talked about today. And I think what I'm not saying is like that youth mental health and this and region doesn't matter, because I think we see evidence that it does more widely, that those inequalities do exist. It may well not be that COVID has exacerbated those, but it is worth us thinking, I think, with my mixed methods head on as somebody who wants to do these big statistical pieces of work, but it's also about that qualitative exploration. I think what's really important is trying to understand actually, well, what's the nuanced impact that's happening in regions, in smaller communities, in kind of different systems that are happening, because we know things like that, you know, spending in relation to mental health, for instance, is really different across combined authorities. We know that different kind of areas have different levels of community response to different things that do have meaning to youth mental health. And so I think it's really important that a take-home message for me, especially having done a lot of qualitative work around COVID and seeing how much young people do feel it's impacted their day-to-day life, is that might not come through in mental health data, but it doesn't mean it's not meaningful, and it doesn't mean it's not something we need to understand is sort of what are the ramifications and effects of COVID for people's lives. But it may not necessarily translate into a worsening of mental health beyond what we're already seeing. This is still me making sense of something that we agreed upon a week ago in our analysis. But yeah, I think I'd be really keen to say it's not to undermine the suggestion that we need to be concerned about mental health across the country. It's thinking in nuanced ways about how that might play out, I think is my takeaway that's still forming. I think I'm going to stop there because otherwise I could ramble, and I don't know how I am on time, but this is analysis that you may have questions about now that I can't necessarily answer, although I can give it a go. Yeah, nice to share what we've been learning, and it was helpful putting together reflections there, I think, to try and make sense of that. So yeah.
Thanks, Ola. That's really fascinating. It's literally hot off the presses research. That's what we like to see. Any questions for Ola based on any of that?
Hi, Ola. All I wanted to add for two things, which might help. I know in some of the other studies, we've done a few. We've done one with the understanding adult data,
yes,
and use similar statistics to you have here. And actually, we don't see changes in mental health either for adults. That doesn't mean nothing's happening, because like you said, it could have been high at the beginning anyway. So it's worth keeping that in mind, that it might be something to do with the statistical method, which I think is an appropriate method. It's just that I think what it's showing is you may get slight changes, but they're not statistical changes. They're not things we need to necessarily worry about, but we may have had something to worry about right in the beginning anyway. So they're not getting worse, but they've always been bad.
Yeah.
And then the other thing was about the way you've determined your regions, because I remember with some of the work that Steph presented before, some of the regional variations that we saw for children in the north on mental health, those primary school data, if you were to do it to look at region in the way you would have done, I don't think you would have seen the variation. I think what we
that's
need
interesting.
to do, so do you remember, Steph, how, because what method did we use to separate it? It was one that you and Matt had used previously, wasn't it?
It's basically the north compared to the rest of England. So it's a very arbitrary measure, but it's just just the northwest Yorkshire and northeast. And the rest of England. But then you do ignore some of those, those variations in things like the Midlands and the east of England as well, which we know is a core.
But then you've also got those other, I can't remember how we split it. So we did split it like that, north and everybody else. And then there was another way that we split it as well, wasn't there, where we had those key different regions, because in there we take account of the fact that down south there are those areas of quite big deprivation. So it might be worth having a look at that report again. I mean, you may not have enough participants in each of those regions, which is why you've gone for looking at those specific ones, but it's worth being able to highlight that in your discussion, I think.
That's really helpful. I've made a note on our draft for Matthias to have a look at, and we can kind of we're going to share around the rest of the Childhood of the North, our little working group that we've had, so we could pick that up and think about how to action that. Thank you.
Really interesting. Okay,
that's great. Thanks, Beth. Any other final points? Otherwise we will move on, conscious of time. No. Okay, in which case we are moving on to our final presentation. This is from Carl Emery, who is a lecturer in education and a social responsibility fellow at the Manchester Institute of Education. And Carl is going to talk to us about educating with a sense of place. Over to you, Carl.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to talk with my colleague who's below me on the Zoom room, which is Louisa Dawes, because we run this together. So we're going to talk to you today, myself and Louisa, about a large research programme we run called Local Matters. And Local Matters is a programme that is around three themes, which are power, poverty and place. And we're trying to empower teachers and school communities to challenge and reshape myths and discourses around poverty. And we are particularly interested in poverty and place, with an emphasis on the northwest of England. So this is research that is trying to examine poverty within a global policy discourse and bring it from the global to the local. So one of the things we're very aware of is that disadvantage is an individual household problem, and that at present solutions lie in fixing things for individuals, very much focused on what is an economically viable citizen and preparation for the workforce. We're also very, very clear that in terms of the disadvantage and attainment gap, that we have a system that believes that one size fits all. This really comes back to these ideas of the what works agenda, as you probably know, and what counts and what doesn't count as evidence. So we're living in a society that's very interested in fixing poverty through what works intervention. Can we do the next slide, Louisa? So the global policy discourses come into England and they shape national policy in England. What we think is going on is this national policy around individualism and how disadvantage is understood and enacted bleaches out so structural social and economic forces such as employment, housing, transport and health, as well as making invisible history, culture, geography and psychology of place. We also think it takes no account of individual characteristics such as gender, race and class, or furthermore, and this taps into maybe the previous two presentations, the emotional costs of poverty. And actually the emotional costs and emotional labour of poverty are research that Louisa is particularly specialising in at the moment. So we feel that the current discourse places all the responsibility on teachers, children and parents to fix poverty. One outcome is conversation and practice is dominated by not globalized, but certainly nationalized interventions such as pupil premium and the Education Endowment Foundation. And these are atomized and measurable. They're one size fits all, and they are what we believe is a metricized approach to people and place, alongside a metricized approach to poverty. Louisa, do you want to pick up from here?
Okay, yeah. So in response to the kind of the outline of what Carl's been saying as far as the standardized practice, both in schools and in a wider governmental policy, what Local Matters does is looks really at that discourse and looks at it in a linguistic way, but also in a far more practical, pragmatic way within schools. So we work within schools thinking about how that discourse has been produced, so the global discourse and how that has come down into most of the Western society and most of the Western education kind of like philosophy of particularly surrounding that social mobility discourse, but also how that's constructed and distributed within schools, within the education policy for many, many years. And really seeing what that version of poverty is, how that is associated with very standardized ways of interventions and looking at students as children in poverty, but not necessarily looking at them as anything apart from a very standardized, what we call a widget going through the educational system. So and essentially the deficit understanding of what children are and the myths associated with children in poverty, particularly associated with the problem to do with attainment, is something that they are particularly focused on, and that schools are focusing on that underachievement. And what we have obviously looked at and seen within the data is that actually this isn't working. This standardized approach and intervention is not working. And unfortunately, according to the latest statistical data, and actually this was kind of like pre-COVID, it will take 500 years to fix that disadvantage gap. So even by the association of the word using disadvantage, we're immediately saying that all children in poverty are disadvantaged and potentially less intelligent than their peers. So we look at that whole discourse and try to deconstruct it and reconstruct it with our colleagues. And therefore, through research-driven practice, we challenge teachers and as also the learners about those policy notions of one size fits all, particularly associated with the charity EEF, but looking very much at building local solutions to local problems. What we suggest is we would want to work on what matters with what works. So really focusing on that, what matters in a contextualized process.
Shall I pick this up, Louisa?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's really critical that what Louisa just said there, we're bringing what matters to what works. And I think, bringing, and in a sense, this again is, I think, talking back to what Ola was saying around data with depth. It's bringing a qualitative depth and criticality to quantitative data. So how we understand and view poverty and how we talk about it shapes what, when, and how those in schools engage with poverty. And one of the things we're really trying to work on developing is notions that poverty is fluid, messy, and localized. It's not just fixed by interventions. And we feel as though at the moment, schools and education is fixed in this very binary approach to poverty, whereby we're either blaming families and children for being poor, or we're feeling sorry for them. And both of those positions are diminishing of children and families in poverty. They remove the agency from children and families in poverty, and they remove their voice and they remove any power they might have. So they're diminishing them even further. What we believe about low-income students and how we relate to them, we think is just as important as how we teach them. And it plays a considerable role in determining how we teach them. So I think really what Local Matters is trying to do is trying to skirmish and shake up this one-size-fits-all approach through our methodology and through working beside teachers and with schools. Can we have the next slide, Louisa?
Yes. Sorry, the telephone rang just at the wrong time.
So our methodological approach is probably best described through the lens of Mike Apple's critical secretary. We employ our academic position and training and skills and we illuminate the dynamics of power and stress of political and social processes inherent to and shaping of education practice and policy responses. We undertake this process to reveal to schools and teachers the limits and possibilities of working in high poverty schools, really featured on the question of whose knowledge is of most worth in this school or in this district. We use a combination of critical discourse analysis and contact theory. So we problematize language, and we problematize language by bringing together great understanding and de-othering communities and people. We work with teachers and leaders over a 12-month period, and we bring a wide range of poverty research to them. So myself and Louisa sit with head teachers, school staff, and we explore the poverty data with them. We interrogate this poverty data from a very critical perspective. And in that process, we train them as school and community social justice researchers. Through that training process, we then work with them and mentor them to lead action research projects in their schools and community. And those action research projects gather knowledge and data around the local community and what poverty looks like locally. The schools and teachers then bring that data back into the school to work on changing policy and practice in the community. We are hoping, and I'm hoping that Louisa's able to do this, that we're going to show you a video before we finish of what that looks like in Blackburn, which is one of the districts we've been working in. Can we do that, Louisa?
Yeah, so just before that, I think it's really important to mention that we regard this as almost a professional learning programme, don't we, for schools? And not only, although you made reference to the agency as far as kind of like learners and parents, there is also a feeling of opportunity to really contextualize the knowledge, the phronesis, the knowledge on the ground of the critical understanding of what's going on in the classroom, and giving permission to those people that actually know their communities and their students the best to actually do the work that they know that they should be doing. So I think as for us, it's really important to note that the attitudes towards poverty, which we investigate and interrogate with staff members, and also the research projects that come out of that are really very much anchored within giving permission for school development projects, for really thinking about the voice of those people in the community, and particularly those teachers in the community that have seemed a little bit hamstrung by other interventions that have potentially are not working, but they have no other way of kind of like telling a greater audience, for example, Ofsted, that that's the case. So it's giving an opportunity, isn't it, to think slightly differently and act slightly differently in schools, particularly surrounding policy and practice in a very structuralist approach. So I'm going to now hopefully share a video with you, and bear with me if it doesn't work. Apologies if it doesn't work. Carl will just have to carry on speaking.
I will. Whilst you're getting the videos together, I'll just tell everybody some practicalities before we finish. So the project has been running for 5 years now. We have worked with around about 100 schools. We're working across the northwest of England with Blackburn, Chester and Stockport districts, also Manchester City Council. We're also working nationally with the National Education Union, and we've just received some significant funding to develop and illuminate the impact of this research programme for the university. So this is really growing into a really interesting and quite significant piece of research. How are you getting on, Louisa?
I've managed to find the video again. Do bear with me. I do apologise. I seem to have lost the sound to it now, so I shall start again. Hate using this video.
Sorry, we want to show this video because this was done by the practitioners themselves, and we feel that, you know, we could talk for another 10 minutes, but this really captures just what the programme has done in a district with very high poverty rates, as you know, which is Blackburn.
Do bear with me, apologies for this. Aha, okay. Can everyone see it?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you hear it?
This is Blackburn Diocese.
Can you hear it?
Blackburn's shiny modern buildings, its rolling green hills, and images of cows and sheep grazing peacefully can mask the significant high levels of deprivation that exists within our schools. In Blackburn Diocese, we have 180 primary schools and 10 secondary schools. The Board of Education supports over 440,000 children in Blackburn with Darwin, Lancashire and Blackpool local authorities. In December 2017, the Board of Education hosted its first Diminishing the Gap Pupil Premium Conference. The aim was to understand some of the challenges facing our most disadvantaged pupils in order to develop strategies to overcome these challenges. Keynote speakers included Sir John Dunsford, former DFE Pupil Premium Czar, and Dr. Emery from Manchester University. At the end of the conference, several of our schools expressed a desire to progress the work further by creating a pupil premium network. So in 2018, 4 of our schools joined Local Matters. The plan was to start small and to roll the programme out to other schools in year 2. Obviously, events of the last 2 years have meant that that hasn't been possible. But our commitment remains building on this work. In October 2020, the Institute for Social and Economic Research published a report that said between 2015 and 2019, Blackburn had the highest increase in child poverty in the North West. Our schools are now going to share with you what they have learned as a result of being part of Local Matters and how they are using their research to influence how they support disadvantaged children in their schools.
We are in an area of deprivation. We have currently 28% children on pupil premium, which has been rising and rose considerably during COVID. However, it still doesn't reflect the area that we live in. We have 98% of our children who are Asian heritage and Muslim faith, and that means a lot of our children have English as an additional language. Within that, we do have a considerable number of children who have no English at all, who are new to English when they join our school in reception, but also when they join mid-year throughout the school. Our action research project was based on children who were pupil premium and what were the success factors that enabled them to reach expected and graded standard. And what we wanted to do was get a better understanding of what these children were experiencing both at home and in school, so that we could start to replicate that within our own school environment for other children who also met that threshold of need.
Currently, we have 196 children on roll, and we look forward to welcoming a full reception class in September. 93% of our children are of white British background and live locally in privately rented houses. 66% of our children are pupil premium, and this is reflected in the area that the school is in. We identified writing as an area of weakness across our academy, and so the focus of the project has been working with parents to investigate some of these barriers and putting a project together to overcome some of these. We're a family school with a strong Christian ethos. We've got 143 pupils on roll over a split site school. 40% of those children are ethnic minority children. At the moment, we've got 30% who are pupil premium children or free school meal children. However, as near ago as 5-6 years ago, it was up to 60%, and we feel that this is a more true representation of what our free school meals are. For our action research topic, we decided to really delve into the children's lives. So the head teacher and I decided to conduct some day diaries. This meant that we spent all day with the children. We came in with the children in the morning and left with the children at the end of the day and spent break times, dinner times and all the lessons with them.
Alongside this, we formed a Me and My Community group. So we got permission from parents and selected a few free school meal pupil premium children, and we gave them a disposable camera and a diary. And each week we set them tasks. From this, we could learn out their strengths, their weaknesses, what they thought about the community, what they thought about school. We even found out their aspirations, what time they went to bed, and the things that they did at the weekend.
St Luke and St Philip's is a Church of England primary school in Blackburn, part of Sodari Multi-Academy Trust. We are one form entry school with 187 children on roll. 49% of children are in receipt of pupil premium, but this is not a true reflection of our school, as 71% of families are classed as being within the bottom 5% of the most deprived households in the UK. Mobility at St Luke and St Philip's is higher than the national average. We have 23 different languages that are spoken in this school, ranging from Eastern Europe to Africa and through to Asia. And because of all of these reasons, our project is aiming on building a community hub for our parents and our families, because some of our parents and families are isolated when they come into our community for a multitude of reasons. And eventually we want the parents to be able to run the project and to run the community hub.
Okay, everybody, so there you go. You've got a flavour for how Local Matters operated in Blackburn, and hopefully that's given you a good idea of what this research is trying to do. So I guess we're just about on time. Apologies if we've run over. If anyone's got any questions, please ask away. And thank you, Louisa, for being so technically gifted that you managed to make that work, because I would have just wept on the screen.
I did get a little hot under the collar with that. Just to signpost you to some of the findings and analysis associated with the work that we've been doing. It's a paper that we have published this year with Carlo as well.
That's great. Thanks, Carl and Louisa. That's really fascinating and really inspiring work. And I think it's just really interesting thinking from an innate perspective how we can do things that have that real local flavour and are real place-based interventions, and how we can learn from what's going on across our different members. I think that's a really useful example of that. So thanks both. Conscious we're just about out of time. So what I'll just say, just to wrap up, I just want to thank all of our presenters today, Pam and Caroline and Neil, Stephanie and Sam, Ola and Carl and Louisa. It's been really fascinating, really interesting insight to what's going on at Manchester, and so some really interesting sort of cross-cutting stuff across there. And I think hopefully we'll be able to share the video, share the recording with more people, and that'll hopefully spark some more conversations going forward as well. Just in terms of next steps, just to say, as mentioned previously, we are planning a workshop, a Child and North workshop in February, to sort of try and knit some of this stuff together and think about where we're going with next steps, and particularly some of those issues around funding that Pam mentioned at the top that are really important to sort of to really sort of catalyse some of this stuff. And we will be going through the institutional champions to try identify attendees for that workshop. So watch this space in terms of that, and hopefully we may have some more of these webinars as well. We still have a few universities that haven't presented yet, so hopefully we'll manage to squeeze in another one of those before the end of the year. But again, just to thank everybody for presenting today, and look forward to continuing the conversation with you all and taking this forward through Child of the North. Thanks, everybody.